The frozen mud of the Lancaster Road clung to Edward Price's boots with the tenacity of a dying man's grip. Each step was a wrenching, sucking effort that pulled not just at his leg, but at some deeper reservoir of his will. Around him, the ragged column of redcoats, what was left of 2 companies of the 23rd Royal Welch Fusiliers taken in a sharp, brutal skirmish outside Philadelphia, shuffled onward. Their faces, once masks of professional hauteur, were now pinched and gray with cold and a gnawing dread. It was the 3rd day of the march, and the December air of Pennsylvania was a blade that flayed the skin and froze the marrow. They were moving deeper into the heart of rebellion, a land they had been taught was peopled by savages and fanatics. Every clatter of a farm wagon, every wisp of smoke from a distant chimney, was a potential threat. The patriot militia who guarded them were a study in contrasts. Grim-faced farmers in homespun, their long rifles held with a casual competence that was more unnerving than the spit and polish of a regular army. They spoke little, offering no taunts, only terse commands to keep moving. "Keep your heads up, lads," Sergeant James Fletcher muttered, his voice a low rasp. He moved along their small line. His 6-foot frame stooped with fatigue but his authority undiminished. "Remember who you are. Soldiers of the King, not cattle." Price, a private of 3 years' service, kept his eyes on the back of the man in front of him. He was a Welshman from a small parish near Brecon, and the rolling, wooded hills of this colony were a cruel mockery of his home. He was 21 years old, and until this moment, his world had been defined by the immutable certainties of the regiment. The call of the bugle, the weight of the brown bess, the absolute authority of the officer class, and the unshakable belief in the crown's majesty. Now all that was gone, replaced by the sucking mud and the silent watchfulness of his captors. Young Samuel Carter, barely 18 and with the downs still on his cheeks, stumbled beside him. "Where are they taking us, Price?" he whispered, his teeth chattering. "To a prison," Price answered, his own voice flat. "Where else?" The word hung in the air, thick with images drawn from barrack room tales. The hulks in the Thames, the dungeons of the Tower. They expected chains, starvation, disease, and the casual cruelty of men who had overturned God's own order. Fletcher had fed these fears, spinning yarns of rebels who gave no quarter and relished the suffering of captured regulars. It was a soldier's duty to expect the worst. It was a way of fortifying the soul against the inevitable. Late in the afternoon, as the winter sun bled out behind a bank of iron-gray clouds, they were halted. Before them lay a small town nestled in a shallow valley, a cluster of stone and timber buildings centered around a starkly simple meeting house. A stockade of sharpened logs, freshly cut and raw-looking, enclosed a long, low barracks and a yard. This was it, Providence, their new home, their cage. The senior militiaman, a captain named Elias Thorne with a beard more gray than brown, conferred with a group of townsmen. One stood out, a broad, placid man in plain gray clothes, his face unlined by anger or triumph. He gestured towards a building separate from the main compound, from which a plume of white steam billowed into the freezing air. "Prisoners, this way," Thorne commanded, his voice devoid of emotion. They were marched not to the barracks, but to this outbuilding, a washhouse. The dread in Price's stomach tightened into a cold knot. This was the beginning of the degradation. They would be stripped, scrubbed like animals, shorn of the last vestiges of their dignity. He caught Fletcher's eye. The sergeant gave a minute, grim nod as if to say, "See? It begins as I told you." Inside, the air was thick with the heat from 2 massive iron cauldrons steaming over a fire pit. The floor was packed earth, dark with damp. Several older women and the man in gray stood waiting. There was no jeering crowd, no spectacle. "Take off thy uniforms," the man in gray said. His voice was calm, resonant. "Place them on the pegs. Ye shall have them back once they are cleaned and mended." He used the plain speech of a Quaker, a sect Price knew only from whispered rumors of their strangeness. Hesitantly, the soldiers began to undress. The room was filled with the rustle of wool, the clink of a button falling to the floor. Price peeled off his coat, The proud red, now stained with mud and sweat, felt like shedding his own skin. He was no longer Private Price of the 23rd foot. He was just a man, pale and thin, in the steam-choked room. "The water is for washing," the Quaker continued, gesturing to a row of wooden barrels filled with hot water. "The soap is lye. It will remove the filth of the road and any vermin ye may carry. It is for thy health." One by one they were directed to the barrels. The water was shockingly hot, the lye soap harsh and biting, stinging the small cuts on their hands and faces. But as Price scrubbed away the layers of grime, something shifted within him. This wasn't a ritual of humiliation. The steam wasn't meant to choke, but to cleanse. The women worked silently, taking their discarded uniforms, their faces showing not scorn, but a kind of weary pragmatism. They were simply doing a job that needed to be done. After the washing came the cropping. A chair was placed in the center of the room. The Quaker himself held the shears. Each soldier sat, head bowed, as his hair, often grown long and queued in military fashion, was cut short. When Fletcher's turn came, he sat ramrod straight, his jaw clenched, enduring the shears as if they were a lash. But the Quaker's hands were steady, his movements efficient, not cruel. He was a craftsman at his work. He was shearing sheep, not shaming men. "Lice breed in long hair," he said simply to the room at large. "In close quarters, cleanliness prevents the flux and the fever. It is a kindness to all." Price felt the cold steel against his scalp, the soft fall of his own hair around his shoulders. He felt a surprising lightness, a clean, sharp sensation. He took a deep breath, the first in days that wasn't tainted by the smell of unwashed bodies and stale fear. The air smelled of wood smoke, lye, and damp earth. It was the smell of a fresh start, a terrifying and unwelcome thought. Finally, they were handed bundles of rough, clean linen, shirts and breeches of a coarse, undyed homespun. It was the clothing of a farmer, not a soldier. Dressed in this anonymous garb, they were no longer a cohesive unit, but a collection of individuals. The red coat, the symbol of their power and identity, was gone. Yet, as they stood there, clean for the first time in weeks, a strange sense of restoration settled over them. They had been stripped, yes, but not to be broken. They had been scoured down to the plain, unadorned man beneath the uniform. As they were led from the washhouse towards the barracks, the first snowflakes of a coming storm began to drift down from the darkening sky, each one a small, cold absolution. From the Journal of Private Edward Price. December 14th, 1777. Arrived at the rebel prison camp at a place they name Providence. Expected chains and torment. Instead, we was made to wash. They took our coats, saying they would be cleaned. The sergeant believes it a trick, to steal them for their own army. They cut our hair short as a new recruit. A Quaker man did the cutting. He spoke of it as a matter of health. "I have never felt so clean, nor so naked." The barracks was one long room, smelling of fresh-cut pine and wood smoke from the stone fireplace that dominated one wall. 2 tiers of simple wooden bunks, filled with clean straw, lined the sides. It was sparse, but it was dry and warm. The prisoners shuffled in, claiming bunks, wrapping themselves in the coarse wool blankets provided. The silence was thick with uncertainty. The expected brutality had not materialized, and its absence was more disorienting than a blow. An hour later, the door creaked open. Captain Thorne and the Quaker, whom they now knew as Friend Abel, the town blacksmith, entered. Behind them, 2 militiamen carried a large, steaming kettle, its aroma filling the room and making mouths water. It was a rich, savory smell of meat and root vegetables. Another man followed with a basket piled high with thick slices of dark bread. "Your supper," Thorne announced, his tone still flat, businesslike. The men were issued wooden bowls and spoons. They lined up, and a woman ladled a thick, hearty stew into each bowl. Price saw chunks of venison, potatoes, and carrots swimming in the rich gravy. He was given 2 pieces of the bread. It was coarse, but it was warm and smelled of yeast. As the prisoners found places on benches or their bunks to eat, A profound quiet fell over the room, broken only by the scraping of spoons against wood. Price took his first bite. The stew was hot, flavorful, and deeply satisfying. It was not the thin, watery gruel they had been warned of. It was better than the salt pork and hardtack that had been their fare for months on campaign. He devoured it, sopping up the last of the gravy with his bread. It was then that he noticed something that stopped his spoon halfway to his mouth. Through the open barracks door, he could see into the main yard. A trestle table had been set up near the guardhouse, and the militia guards, including Captain Thorne, were lining up. The same woman who had served the prisoners was now ladling stew from the very same kettle into their bowls. They were eating the exact same meal. Price looked around the room. Other prisoners had noticed it too. Carter was staring, his mouth slightly agape. Even Sergeant Fletcher, who had been eating with a grim, defiant determination, paused and narrowed his eyes, a flicker of confusion crossing his features. This simple act, the sharing of a single pot, was a more profound shock than any cruelty could have been. In the British Army, the officers dined on port and roasted fowl while the men made do with whatever the quartermaster provided. The distinction was as fundamental as the color of their coats. To see a commander share the common fare with his men, and for that same fare to be given to his prisoners, was to witness a world turned upside down. "It's a trick," Fletcher hissed, though his voice lacked its earlier conviction. "Fattening us up. For what, I don't know. But it's a trick." "Fattening us for what, Sergeant?" asked a fusilier named Atkinson. "There's no slave market for soldiers here." "To soften us," Fletcher snapped. "To make us forget our duty. A full belly makes a man weak. Remember that." But Price wasn't so sure. He watched friend Abel move among the tables, speaking quietly with the guards. There was no hierarchy in his posture, no deference in theirs. They were simply men sharing a meal at the end of a long day. Abel then walked back towards the prisoners' barracks, carrying his own bowl of stew. He did not enter, but sat on a stump just outside the doorway, in plain view of them all, and began to eat. He ate slowly, methodically, as if giving thanks for each spoonful. The sight was strangely compelling. Here was one of their principal captors, the man who had overseen their shearing, sitting in the cold, sharing their food. He was not gloating. He was not performing. He was simply having his supper. The act was so ordinary, so utterly devoid of malice, that it felt extraordinary. Price finished his bread, the warmth spreading through his chest. The fear that had been his constant companion for days had not vanished, but it had changed its shape. It was no longer the sharp fear of violence, but a dull, unsettling confusion. He had been trained to understand the world through a lens of order, discipline, and hierarchy. King, officer, sergeant, private, each man in his place. This place, this town of Providence, operated by a different set of rules he could not yet decipher. The shared meal was the first lesson, a simple parable of the kettle that spoke of a commonality he had never been allowed to consider. He was a prisoner, an enemy, yet he had eaten from their pot. The thought was a crack in the foundation of his world. The days settled into a rhythm as unyielding as the winter frost. There was no idleness. After a breakfast of porridge with a dollop of molasses, the able-bodied prisoners were marched out of the stockade under guard to work parties. Some were sent to the woods to chop firewood, others to the mill to repair a sluice gate. Price, along with Fletcher, Carter, and a dozen others, was assigned to a plot of cleared land at the edge of the town, where they were tasked with splitting rails to build a new pasture fence. Their overseer was friend Abel. He arrived each morning not with a musket, but with a wagon laden with tools, heavy iron wedges, mauls with heads of dense burl wood, and broad axes honed to a razor's edge. He began the first day not with orders, but with a demonstration. He selected a thick log of oak, studied its grain for a moment, then set a wedge into a promising crack at one end. "Let the tool's weight do the work," he said, his voice calm and even. "Force will break the handle or thy back. Find the path the wood wishes to follow." He swung the heavy maul in a smooth, powerful arc. The sound of the impact was a deep, resonant thump, and the wedge bit deeper. Another swing and another. With a final, sharp crack, the log split cleanly in two. He then showed them how to use the broad axe to hew the split logs into straight, flat-sided rails. There was an economy to his movements, a deep, practical knowledge that commanded more respect than any shouted command. At first, the soldiers worked with a sullen, resentful energy. They were fusiliers, not farmhands. Splitting rails was peasants' work. Fletcher, in particular, attacked the logs with a furious, clumsy strength, trying to overpower the wood through sheer will. He broke a maul handle within the first hour. Friend Abel walked over, picked up the broken tool, and examined it without a word of reprimand. He looked at Fletcher. "The wood does not yield to anger, friend Fletcher," he said quietly. "It yields to patience." He handed him a spare handle from the wagon. "Thee will learn." Price watched and listened. He found a rhythm in the work, the swing of the maul becoming a predictable, steady beat. The cold air burned his lungs, and his hands, soft from months of campaign, were quickly blistered and raw. But the physical exertion was a strange kind of solace. It left no room for the circular thoughts of fear and despair that had plagued him on the march. There was only the log, the wedge, and the satisfying split of the grain. Discipline on the work site was maintained not by threats, but by the work itself. A man who did not pull his weight meant a heavier load for the others. A poorly split rail was useless and had to be discarded, a waste of everyone's effort. The guards stood at a distance, their rifles leaned against a tree, watching but rarely interfering. The real authority was the quiet competence of Abel and the unyielding reality of the task. There was no shouting, no bullying, no sergeant's cane. There was only the work and the silent expectation that it would be done properly. One afternoon, young Carter, clumsy with cold, swung his axe carelessly and sliced a deep gash in his boot leather. He swore under his breath and sat down, dejected. The boot was ruined, and in this cold that was a serious matter. Fletcher stalked over. "Careless boy. Now you'll be on your uppers in the snow." Abel heard the commotion and came to inspect the damage. He knelt, turning the boot over in his large, calloused hands. "A clean cut," he observed. "It can be mended." He looked at Carter. "Tonight, leave this with the guard. I will take it to the cobbler. The cost of the leather and thread will be marked against thy work tally." Carter stared, dumbfounded. "Marked? How?" Abel pointed to a small wooden board he carried, upon which he made notches with a knife. "Each man's work is tallied. A day's fair labor earns a full mark. That mark can be redeemed at the storehouse for small comforts, tobacco, a needle, paper. Or it can be used to pay for a repair such as this. It is a simple accounting." Fletcher scoffed. "A debt, then? A way to bind us?" "It is a way for a man to provide for his own needs," Abel corrected him gently. "Thee are prisoners of war, but thee are still men with wants. The work provides a means to meet them. Is that not just?" He walked away, leaving Fletcher scowling and Carter staring at his ruined boot with a dawning sense of wonder. Price felt it again, that disorienting shift in his understanding. They were being compensated for their labor, not with coin but with a system of credit that acknowledged their humanity, their small personal needs. It was a system built on ledgers and trust, not on coercion. He looked at his own blistered hands. They ached, but for the first time he felt that the ache was productive. He was not just a captive body being forced into meaningless toil. He was earning his keep in a way. He was splitting rails, and in return the world would give him a sheet of paper, a length of thread, a measure of dignity. The steady ring of the maul against the wedge sounded different after that, less a sound of bondage and more the rhythm of a strange, new kind of life. The first Sabbath in Providence was the quietest day Edward Price had ever known. The relentless rhythm of the axe and maul ceased. No work parties were formed. The guards in the yard seemed fewer, their movements slower, more subdued. A profound stillness settled over the town, a quiet so deep it felt like a physical presence. From the barracks, the prisoners watched as the townspeople emerged from their homes. They were dressed in their best, plain clothes, dark grays and browns for the men, bonnets and simple dresses for the women. They did not move with the boisterous energy of a market-day crowd, but with a sober, deliberate pace. They converged on the meeting house, its unadorned walls and clear glass windows seeming to absorb the pale winter light. There was no peal of bells, no organ music, only the soft crunch of boots on the frosted ground. "Look at them," Fletcher sneered from his bunk. "A nest of crows going to roost. So pious. I wager they pray for our damnation with one breath and plan how to work us to death with the next." But Price saw no malice in the faces that passed. He saw solemnity, a deep-seated gravity. These were the people whose husbands and sons were away fighting, whose lives had been upended by a war declared by a king thousands of miles away. Yet they walked with a quiet purpose that seemed to emanate from the very ground beneath their feet. The prisoners were not required to attend any service. They were left to their own devices within the stockade. Some played cards with a greasy, handmade deck. Others slept. But Price found himself drawn to the fence, watching the meeting house. After a long silence, a sound began to drift from the building. It was not the soaring, complex harmony of an Anglican choir, accompanied by the thunder of an organ. It was simpler, more raw. It was the sound of human voices, unadorned, singing a hymn. The melody was plain, almost stark, but the blended voices of the congregation gave it a powerful, resonant quality. It was a sound of immense certainty, a declaration of faith that needed no embellishment. The tune was unfamiliar to Price, but the feeling it evoked was not. It reminded him of the psalms sung in his own small parish church in Wales, the sound of his neighbors and family lifting their voices together. A few of the other prisoners gathered at the fence with him. Carter stood beside him, his expression thoughtful. "It's a strange sound," he murmured. "Sad, but not unhappy." "It's the sound of fanatics," Fletcher spat, joining them, "singing their rebel psalms while our comrades die in the field." Suddenly, another sound joined the first. From the guardhouse, one of the militiamen, a young man with a clear tenor voice, had begun to sing a different hymn, one Price recognized. It was a familiar Anglican tune, one often sung by the troops on the march. "The Lord's my shepherd, I'll not want. He makes me down to lie. In pastures green he leadeth me, the quiet waters by." For a strange, suspended moment, the two melodies intertwined in the cold air. The plain, resolute hymn of the meeting house and the more lyrical, familiar tune of the guard. They did not clash, but braided together, two different expressions of a shared, underlying hope. The colonial tune was spare and communal. The British one was a soldier's plea for peace. They rose together, hung in the stillness, and then faded, one after the other, leaving behind an even deeper silence. Price felt a lump form in his throat. In that brief braid of music, he had heard something that defied the simple categories of enemy and friend. He had heard two separate worlds, two opposing armies, expressing the same fundamental human longing. It was a cultural encounter that happened not in a debate or a battle, but in the accidental harmony of a winter morning. It suggested a common ground he had never imagined existed. Later that afternoon, another small spectacle unfolded. A muster was called on the town green. It was not a drill of professional soldiers. It was a gathering of men and older boys, farmers, smiths, coopers, millers. They were commanded by Captain Thorne, who put them through basic maneuvers. They were clumsy, their lines wavered, but they handled their long rifles with an easy familiarity. They were not playing at being soldiers. They were citizens preparing to defend this place. Their authority came not from a commission bestowed by a distant monarch, but from the consent of their neighbors. They were drilling to protect the very community that now held Price and his comrades captive. The sight was deeply unsettling. This wasn't a rabble, as the officers in London called them. This was an organized, determined community. Their power wasn't in their uniforms or their perfect drill, but in their shared purpose. The quiet of their Sabbath, the sober determination of their muster, the simple authority of their hymn. It all pointed to a strength that Price's military training had not prepared him to understand. It was the strength of a people who believed they were masters of their own house. From the Journal of Private Edward Price. December 21st, 1777. The Lord's Day. The rebels keep it with a quiet I have never known. No work, no noise. We heard them singing in their meeting house. A plain and doleful sound, yet it had a kind of strength to it. One of the guards sang a hymn I knew from home. It made me think on my mother. It is a strange thing to be held prisoner by men who sing the same psalms to God as we do. It makes the business of killing them seem a greater sin. The long, cold weeks of January wore on, and the initial shock of their captivity gave way to a grinding monotony. The daily routine of work, the simple meals, the long evenings in the barracks, it became the new reality. And within that reality, tensions began to grow. The barracks became a debating society, a microcosm of the larger conflict. The central figures were Sergeant Fletcher and Edward Price. Fletcher was the voice of unbending honor, the keeper of the regimental flame. He saw every small kindness as a carefully laid trap, a form of psychological warfare designed to erode their discipline and loyalty. "Don't you see what they're doing?" he would argue, his voice low and intense as they huddled near the fire after a day's labor. This fair treatment, the decent food, the work tallies, is poison. It's meant to make us soft, to make us question our cause. They want us to go back to the army and spread the word that the rebellion is not so bad, that these farmers are just simple, honest folk. And what if they are? Carter ventured one evening, emboldened by a rare ration of cider. Fletcher rounded on him. "They are traitors to their king. They have taken up arms against their lawful sovereign. That is the only truth that matters. Everything else is a lie, a deception." This Quaker, Abel, with his calm voice and his friends. He is the most dangerous of them all. A snake in plain clothes. Price, who often found himself working alongside Abel at the fence line or near the forge, could no longer accept Fletcher's rigid certainty. He had seen the blacksmith's hands, scarred and calloused from a lifetime of hard, honest work. He had heard the man speak of his family, of the harvest, of the proper way to season oak for a wagon wheel. He had witnessed 100 small acts of decency that could not be explained away as a grand, manipulative strategy. "I see a man who works hard and treats others with respect, Sergeant," Price countered quietly. "He has offered us no insult. He has seen to our needs. He has seen to our needs to make us better laborers." Fletcher shot back. "A farmer does not whip his ox to death if he wants the field plowed. He feeds it. He shelters it. We are their oxen." The argument simmered, dividing the prisoners into factions. The older soldiers, veterans of other campaigns, tended to side with Fletcher. Their identities were forged in the crucible of the British Army, and they could not comprehend a world without its rigid hierarchies and clear lines of enmity. But the younger men, like Carter, were more impressionable. They saw the logic in the daily life of Providence. They saw that competence was valued over station, that community was built on mutual obligation. They were being disarmed not by force, but by the quiet example of a different way of living. The moral hinge, the incident that brought the simmering tension to a boil, was a small thing, a pair of boots. Carter's mended boot had held up for a time, but the other one was now falling apart, the sole flapping with every step. The winter had deepened, and a man with bad boots in the snow was a man courting frostbite and fever. Carter grew withdrawn, his work slowed by the constant, painful effort of walking. One morning, as they prepared for the work detail, friend Abel noticed Carter's limp. He stopped the young man and examined the failing boot. He said nothing, but his expression was one of concern. Later that day he approached Price. "Friend Price," he said, his voice low so others could not hear. "Young Samuel's boots will not last the week. There is a pair at the storehouse, left by a traveler. They are used but sound. They might fit him." "He has no tally marks to spare," Price said immediately. "He used them for the first repair." Abel nodded slowly. "I know this, but a man cannot work without proper shoes. It is inefficient, and it is not right." He paused, looking Price directly in the eye. "I have spoken with Captain Thorne. We will advance the boots against his future labor. It will take him many weeks to work off the debt. A debt he may never repay if he is exchanged," Price pointed out. "That is a risk we will take," Abel said simply. "A man's health is of more consequence than a few marks in a ledger." That evening, a pair of sturdy, well-oiled leather boots were delivered to the barracks for Carter. The boy was speechless, turning them over and over in his hands as if they were made of gold. He looked at Price, his eyes shining with gratitude. When Fletcher saw the boots, he exploded. "You see, a trap. Now the boy is in their debt for good. They own him. He'll be so grateful to his rebel masters he'll forget he even has a king. You were a fool to let him accept it, Price." "He was a fool to have feet that get cold, Sergeant?" Price retorted, his patience finally snapping. "What was the alternative? Let him lose a toe to the frost? Is that what King George requires of us? To rot from the feet up out of pride? It is what honor requires." Fletcher roared, his face purpling. "We take nothing from these traitors. We owe them nothing but contempt. We owe them for the food we eat and the roof over our heads," Price said, his voice shaking with a conviction that surprised him. "And they have asked for nothing but a fair day's work in return. I see no dishonor in that. I see only a man, Abel, who did not wish to see a boy suffer." The barracks fell silent. The two men stood facing each other, the firelight casting long, dancing shadows on the walls. It was more than an argument over a pair of boots. It was a clash of two irreconcilable worldviews. One was built on the rigid, abstract principles of honor, duty, and empire. The other was grounded in the simple, tangible realities of human need, compassion, and practical decency. In the quiet that followed, Price knew something had irrevocably broken inside him. He could no longer see the world through Sergeant Fletcher's eyes. The plain, ordered life of Providence had fractured his certainty forever. The desire to write a letter home became an ache in Price's chest, a physical need as strong as hunger. He needed to connect with the world he had left behind, to tell his family in Wales that he was alive. But more than that, he felt a desperate, confusing urge to try and explain the unexplainable reality of his captivity. How could he describe this place, where the enemy was not a monster, but a man who worried about the state of a prisoner's boots? He approached friend Abel during a break in the work. "I wish to write a letter," he said, the words feeling formal and stiff. Abel nodded. "That can be arranged. Paper and ink are available at the storehouse. They carry a cost of 1/2 mark. Price had been working diligently. He had a small surplus of marks notched on the tally board. The next evening, after the meal, he presented himself at the small, sturdy building that served as the community storehouse and the office for Captain Thorne. The storehouse was a marvel of order. Barrels of flour and salted meat were neatly stacked. Tools hung from pegs. Everything had its place. Thorne sat at a large wooden desk, a ledger book open before him. The book was the heart of the prisoner system, the silent arbiter of their small economy. "Price, Edward, 23rd foot," Thorne said, his voice less gruff than usual. "Abel said you would be coming." He ran his finger down a page. "You have 2.5 marks to your credit. A letter will cost you 1/2. Do you agree?" "I do," Price said. Thorne made a note in the ledger, the scratching of his quill the only sound in the room. He then reached into a drawer and pulled out a single sheet of clean, cream-colored paper, a sharpened goose quill, and a small packet of ink powder. He pushed them across the desk. "You may write at the table yonder. A candle is permitted for 1 hour. Your letter will be read before it is sent." Price took the materials to a small table in the corner. The simple act of receiving them felt momentous. He mixed the powder with a little water in a clamshell, creating a small pool of dark ink. He smoothed the paper, the precious, clean surface a stark contrast to the rough-hewn world around him. He dipped the quill and then he paused. What could he possibly write? He began with the simple truths. "My dearest mother and father, I pray this letter finds you in good health, as it leaves me. I am a prisoner, taken in a skirmish near Philadelphia, but you are not to worry. He stared at the words. You are not to worry. It was a lie and it was the truth. He was a captive in a foreign land, in the midst of a war. But he was not starving. He was not in chains. He was warmer and better fed than he had been on campaign. How to explain the rest? He couldn't write. My captors are Quakers and farmers who treat us with a strange and unsettling decency. It would be censored. It might even be seen as treasonous. He had to write between the lines, to embed the truth in the mundane details. We are housed in a dry barracks and given work to do, for which we are compensated with a kind of credit. With this I have purchased this paper. The work is hard, we are splitting rails for fences, but it is honest labor and keeps a man warm in the cold. The food is plentiful. We eat a stew of venison and roots, much like a call from home, and have good bread with it. He described the landscape, the rolling hills that reminded him of Breconshire. He described the cold, the deep snows of January. He avoided any mention of military matters, of Fletcher, of his own internal turmoil. But as he wrote, he felt a profound sense of guilt. He was describing a life of simple, rustic peace, a life his own army had come to disrupt and destroy. He was a cog in a great imperial machine sent to crush the very people who were now showing him such plain, unadorned humanity. The contrast was a weight on his soul. He ended the letter with assurances of his love and prayers for his family and his king. The last part felt hollow, a duty performed rather than a sentiment felt. He read it over. It was a careful, guarded document, a map of his confusion. He hoped his mother could read the truths hidden in his description of the stew, in his mention of earning the paper itself. He hoped she would understand that he was not being broken, but remade into something he no longer recognized. He handed the letter to Thorne. The captain read it slowly, his lips moving slightly. He nodded, folded it, and trickled hot wax onto the seam, pressing it with a simple, unadorned seal. It will go out with the next post-rider to Philadelphia, Thorne said. From there, it will be sent across the lines under a flag of truce. God willing, it will find its way to Wales. Price walked back to the barracks under a sky brilliant with cold stars. The ledger, the quill, the carefully chosen words, it all felt like a confession. He had borne witness to the enemy's humanity, and in the act of writing it down, he had sealed his own quiet treason against the simple certainties with which he had gone to war. The guilt was not for what he had written, but for what he now believed. February thawed into a muddy March, bringing with it the promise of spring and an intensification of the work. The ground softened, and the prisoners were put to new tasks. Price's work party was reassigned to the blacksmith's shop, where friend Abel was overseeing the repair of wagons and tools in preparation for the spring planting. The forge was the heart of the town, a dark, cavernous space filled with the rhythmic clang of the hammer, the roar of the bellows, and the sharp, clean smell of hot iron and coal smoke. For Price, it was a world away from the open-air work of splitting rails. It was a place of intense focus and collaborative effort. His job was simple at first, to work the great bellows, feeding air to the hungry heart of the forge. It was mindless, physical work, but it gave him a privileged position from which to observe Abel. The blacksmith was a master of his craft. He moved with a grace that belied his size, reading the language of the glowing iron, knowing the precise moment to pull it from the fire, the exact force needed from the hammer. He worked not with rage, but with a deep, focused intelligence, coaxing the metal into new shapes. One afternoon, they were working on repairing a broken axle spindle for a farm cart. The iron was old and flawed. Abel heated it, laid it on the anvil, and struck it, but a hairline crack threatened to deepen and ruin the piece. He cursed under his breath, a quiet, frustrated drat, and placed the iron back into the coals, his brow furrowed in thought. Price watched, and a memory surfaced. His village smithy back in Wales, a man named Rees, had a particular trick for dealing with difficult, impure iron. "Friend Abel," he said, his voice hesitant. Abel looked up from the fire, his face slick with sweat. Yes, friend Price. The iron, it seems brittle. My village smith, he would sometimes add a sprinkle of sand and crushed oyster shell to the fire when the iron was so. He said it helped draw out the impurities. Abel stared at him for a long moment. There was no flicker of pride or professional defensiveness in his eyes, only curiosity. He considered the suggestion, stroking his chin. Sand I have. Shells? There are some by the chicken coop. Fetch them. Price scrambled to do as he was told, returning with a handful of crushed shells. Abel took them, mixed them with a little sand, and tossed the mixture onto the glowing coals around the iron bar. The fire hissed and flared with a greenish light. He let the iron soak in the intense heat for several minutes longer than usual. Then, with a decisive movement, he pulled it from the forge. It glowed with a brighter, more uniform yellow-white light. He placed it on the anvil. Strike now, he said to his apprentice, a lanky local boy. And you, Price. A steady rhythm on the bellows. The apprentice struck, Abel deftly turning the iron with his tongs. The sound of the hammer was different this time. A solid, ringing note, not the dull thud of before. They worked quickly, the metal yielding, shaping, the cracks seeming to fuse and vanish under the force of the blows. When they were done, the spindle was straight and strong, the flawed section smooth and whole. Abel quenched the piece in the slack tub, a great cloud of steam erupting with a furious hiss. He pulled it out and inspected it, turning it over and over, tapping it with a small hammer. It rang true. He looked at Price. He didn't offer effusive thanks or praise. He simply gave a slow, deliberate nod. It was a small gesture, a silent acknowledgement from one craftsman to another. In that nod, the vast gulf between prisoner and captor, between redcoat and rebel, vanished entirely. For that one moment, they were simply two men who understood the properties of iron and fire, joined by the shared satisfaction of a job well done. That evening, as Price pumped a bucket of water from the well, Abel approached him again. He was holding something in his hand. It was a small, beautifully crafted iron hook, the kind used for hanging a pot over a fire, its end twisted into a graceful, decorative curl. For thy mother's hearth, Abel said, pressing it into Price's hand. The metal was still faintly warm. A good piece of iron should not be wasted. Price stood there holding the hook. It was a simple, useful object, made with care and skill. It was a gift from his enemy. He looked from the hook to the blacksmith's face, and he could find no words. He simply nodded, just as Abel had nodded to him earlier. It was all the thanks that was needed. The propaganda of war, the speeches of generals, the hatred stoked in 1,000 barracks. All of it felt like a flimsy lie in the face of the solid, undeniable reality of the iron hook in his hand. The arrival of the news was as sudden and disruptive as a musket shot in the quiet of the morning. A post-rider, his horse lathered in sweat, delivered a packet of official dispatches to Captain Thorne. Within the hour, the prisoners were assembled in the yard. The late March sun was warm on their backs, and the air carried the scent of thawing earth. Thorne stood before them, a sheet of paper in his hand. Friend Abel stood beside him, his expression unreadable. An agreement for a limited exchange of prisoners has been reached between General Washington and General Howe, Thorne announced, his voice carrying across the yard. A number of you are to be paroled and marched to the transfer point at Germantown. When I read your name, step forward. A murmur ran through the ranks of the prisoners. Exchange. The word was a jolt of lightning, a sudden, shocking promise of freedom, of a return to the world they knew. Thorne began to read the list. Atkinson, Robert, Collins, Henry, Fletcher, James. Sergeant Fletcher's name cracked through the air. He snapped to attention, a look of fierce, triumphant joy on his face. He shot a look at Price, a look that said, I have won. I have endured. I have not bent. Price, Edward. Price's own name barely registered. He felt a dizzying wave of relief, so powerful it almost buckled his knees. He was going home. He would see his regiment, his comrades. He would see Wales again. He stepped forward automatically, his heart pounding. Thorne continued down the list. When he finished, there were 15 names, including most of the older veterans. Samuel Carter's name had not been called. Price looked over at the boy. Carter's face had crumpled. His brief flicker of hope extinguished. He stood among the remaining prisoners, looking smaller and more lost than ever. He would be staying behind. The relief Price felt was now tainted with a sharp, unexpected pang of what? Reluctance. Guilt. He was leaving. He was abandoning Carter and the others to this strange, quiet life. He was returning to the war, to the killing, to the rigid certainties he now knew to be incomplete. The thought of putting on his red coat again, of picking up his musket, filled him not with pride, but with a weary dread. His time in Providence had changed him. He was no longer the same soldier who had marched down the Lancaster road in fear and hatred. The preparations for departure were swift. Their original uniforms, washed, mended, and neatly folded, were returned to them. Putting on the familiar red wool felt strange. It was stiff and confining after months in loose homespun. It felt like a costume, a role he was no longer sure how to play. The farewells were awkward. Fletcher clapped men on the back, full of bluster and promises of seeing them again after the rebellion was crushed. "We'll be back for you lads," he boomed. "Keep your spines straight." Price found Carter sitting on his bunk, staring at the floor. "They'll exchange you soon, Sam," Price said, the words feeling thin and useless. Carter looked up, his eyes wet. Maybe he held out his hand. "Good luck, Ed. Don't forget us." "I won't," Price said, shaking his hand. The promise felt heavy, binding. He sought out friend Abel, finding him by the forge, banking the fire for the night. "I came to say thank you," Price said. Abel turned, wiping his hands on a leather apron. He looked at Price in his red coat, his gaze lingering for a moment. "Thee have been a good worker, Edward Price. Thy hands know how to learn," he paused. "The world is a complex place. A man's duty is often not as clear as he is told. I pray thee finds a peaceful path." He offered no handshake, but gave another of his small, significant nods. As the paroled prisoners formed up to leave, one of the townswomen, the same one who had served them their first meal, approached Price. She pressed a bundle into his hands. It was a small loaf of bread, still warm from the oven, wrapped in a clean piece of homespun cloth. "For the road," she said, and turned away before he could thank her. He stood there, holding the warm loaf, the symbol of their first meal, the first crack in his certainty. He was leaving a prison where he was fed by his captors, taught a trade by his overseer, and given a gift upon his departure. The paradox of it all was a physical weight in his chest. He was relieved to be leaving, yet heartbroken to go. He feared returning not to danger, but to a world where such quiet decencies were impossible. The column of 15 redcoats marched out of the stockade as the sun set, casting long shadows across the yard. The remaining prisoners watched them go in silence. Price did not look back at them. He couldn't bear to see Carter's face. He fixed his eyes on the road ahead, the road that led back to the war. As they cleared the last houses of the town, he risked a single glance over his shoulder. The light was fading fast, the valley sinking into a purple twilight. Most of the houses were dark. But in one window, the window of the blacksmith's house which stood beside the forge, a single lantern had been lit. It was a small, steady point of yellow light in the growing darkness. It was not a beacon nor a signal. It was simply a light against the night, a sign of a home, of a life continuing in its ordinary rhythm. The image burned itself into his mind. He turned back to the road, clutching the warm loaf of bread to his chest. The lantern in the window was the last thing he saw of Providence. It was a closing image of a world he had entered as an enemy and was leaving as something else. He did not have a name for what he had become. He only knew that the small, steady light would travel with him, a quiet, lingering question in the darkness of the war to come. He wondered if he would ever find his way back to such a simple, uncomplicated light again. The road was dark, and for the first time, he was not sure where it was truly leading.